Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this Sunday. We have two special guests again. I'm accompanied here by Franz Vermeulen and Linda Johnston. And today they are going to be going over Vista Vintage information. We are going to leave around 10 minutes or so for questions at the end. So please ask questions. If you have questions throughout the presentation, just jot them down in either the chat room or the Q&A, and I'll make sure to ask Linda and Franz those questions at the end. So thank you both so much for joining us. We're so excited to have you again.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning or good day, wherever you are.
So this is part 2 in our 2-part series called New Dimensions of Materia Medica. And just to review, our last session a month ago was about source and substance Materia Medica, which is Franz Vermeulen's masterwork. It's an equivalent of about 8,000 computer pages, although it's not available in printed form. It's an adjunct to your computer program. And what it does is it details the information on approximately 4,200 different substances that we use as homeopathic remedies. So, we have our traditional Materia Medicas, but we also want to use and gather information about each substance as its own substance. And that information, we're learning more and more, has a great contribution to understanding the remedy, understanding the substance, and being able to prescribe. So this composite of 4,200 substances really covers most every single remedy that is in the major computer programs. So that way, if you are studying or if you're prescribing and you think somebody needs an odd little remedy that is off the beaten track, you can likely find information in your computer program through source and substance that you wouldn't necessarily find anywhere else. Now, before we go on to today's presentation, I just want to make another reference that last time I presented a case, and I did invite anyone who wanted the full written version of that case just to write in to our host, and she will make sure that you get that. So today, we're going to just dive right into a case, and then use this case as a springboard to understand about Vista Vintage, which is another of Franz's products, how to use it, what it's good for, and how it helps in prescribing. So to present this case, we start with SC, our lady patient, who's a 40-year-old housewife and artist. And when she presented to me, she had had asthma for many years. So the following is the case in her own words. She says, "I haven't felt good for a long time. Since an auto accident 5 years ago, I've had muscle spasms in my back. I have no energy, and my asthma is so much worse. With my asthma, it's hard to breathe, and I've used all the steroids for asthma. By age 30, I had had bronchitis 4 times in a row, and I had to use stronger and stronger antibiotics. My asthma didn't get bad until then. I've had lots of abuse, physical and some sexual and also emotional. I've had a lot of therapy for it, and that therapy has really helped me. But I've also done lots of praying about it too. They all said it was a miracle that I even survived. Most people with my background end up in mental institutions. My brother killed himself. He was a schizophrenic. My mother was institutionalized and got shock treatments. I was always afraid of my brother. He would hit me, and I never knew what he was going to do next. If he would stay in his room alone with me, I didn't know if he was going to hurt me. I was always scared. I was scared when his friends were around also because they were really mean. My father and my brother would torture insects, and my father also would torture animals. Now, you can imagine what kind of background this is that this young girl is growing up in, with this kind of inheritance and this kind of family environment. Sometimes I get depressed, but not like I used to. I attribute my improvement to prayer. I don't hold grudges like I used to, and I don't get depressed or scared. It's important when someone is giving a case and they deny something that you should have a high degree of suspicion when something is denied. Now, it doesn't automatically mean that no one can ever make a denial without it being meaningful, but here's a woman who had held grudges and was depressed and was scared, and now she's denying it. You have to take that into consideration. She says, I don't hold grudges like I used to. I don't get as depressed or scared. You want to keep it in the back of your mind that these emotions are probably still very active, but maybe suppressed. I've changed my name several times over the years. At college, I was a bit anorexic. I weighed about 102 pounds. In my opinion, I didn't look good. I didn't look healthy. I got pleasure from not eating. It made my father happy that I was so skinny. I dressed really strangely in those days. In college, I used to wear an old bathrobe to school. I wouldn't brush my hair and it always looked tangled. Often I didn't even wash it. So now we're starting to see some of the expressions she makes as a result of her internal state. In high school, I wore very weird clothes. Old 50s prom dresses, Japanese pants, judo pants that were spray painted. I wore a kimono with these little wooden shoes and funny hats. I was very flamboyant. I have a recurrent dream since I was in my first house. In the dream, my husband and I are secretly married. We have to live in an old, ugly bedroom. We lie on a mattress on the floor, but sometimes we're sleeping at my parents' house. That house has glass walls and they can look at us. At my parents' house, we can't even lock the door and they can see us. We had no privacy. They can look at us anytime they want. So this is another important thing. On one hand, she's very flamboyant and does things that are obvious to attract attention, that will attract attention, wearing funny clothes and not brushing her hair. On the other hand, she has dreams about having no privacy, being looked at, and not being able to maintain her sense of privacy. So these are two sides of the same coin. So again, just put that in the back of your mind and let's see what happens with it. I felt so exposed and naked. Even if we were under the covers, I had no privacy. I felt as if I didn't have any skin, like a stinging feeling. It feels cold. I can even feel it right now. It's a buzzing feeling. Someone wants to run my life and take over. At least with my husband, I feel I have boundaries. I feel like I don't have any boundaries, but I feel a little bit like I do now. In high school and in junior high school, I felt as if parts of me were drifting all over the place. Now I feel enclosed. I'm not sure who I am. I don't even know how to be assertive. I don't know how to make people stay back. They can do whatever they want. I was not connected to my parents except in unhealthy ways, like when they would hit me or tell me what to do or where to go. Now we're starting to see the case develop, that the issue is starting to become clear that it's an issue of boundaries, that when she was younger and her brother would hit her or things would go on in the house that she couldn't stop, she's telling us that she had a sense that she had no boundaries, that she couldn't stop these things. Just like in the dream, she couldn't stop people looking at her, that she was exposed. So now we have to see all these pieces starting to make sense in the context of her whole case. I felt as if I was drifting all around and others were drifting to me. There were no boundaries. Now I would just say, go away. But back then I didn't know how to say that. In 6th grade, boys teased me, so I ignored them. 2 boys teased me every day and I didn't know how to make them stop. So I finally changed to another school. So here's another example of she didn't have the boundaries. She didn't know how to get people to stop the teasing or the tormenting. It's so hard to remember that period of time. I just didn't even feel that person was me. I went way below the surface and someone else was being me. I couldn't handle my life. I felt the real me was safe down under the layers, and that was the only way I could deal with it. So when there's a trauma or a traumatic situation, we all have to develop strategies to keep ourselves safe and keep ourselves sane. And in her case, both were operative. So when she's around this kind of constant violation of her boundaries, where she couldn't even make boundaries, people teasing her or tormenting her, and she couldn't look to her parents to make those boundaries for her because her parents were really nutty as well. So what could she do? What strategy did she have? Well, the strategy she had was to go beneath the surface. Before therapy, I didn't keep my hair combed and I didn't eat much. I was really confused. I felt bleak. I felt that dry, but I didn't know how to use it. I had a strong faith in God, so I knew I really didn't want to kill myself. So here's another denial. So what was one of the things that happened to her when she was younger? She wanted to kill herself, and she turned to faith in God to prevent that from happening. But this denial is important to point that out. But I often thought of different ways to do it. I had visions of how to do it. I would see a gun and saw myself shoot myself in the head or take poison. Every few seconds, I saw those visions. So you can see now, she's looking back, you can see how precarious it was for her to live in that, how close she was to committing suicide, how tempting and appealing that option was. And so to not only protect herself from those tormenting outside of her, but there was also a need to protect herself from her own impulses of self-destruction. I was afraid to kill myself because of my faith in God. I didn't want to do something wrong. I knew I wasn't crazy, but even so, I never even went to buy a gun. I remember the disconnected feelings. I wasn't real. I wasn't whole. I was like a puppet on a string. I wasn't in control of what I wanted to do. I felt that one of my arms was hovering over in a corner and my head was where it was, but my limbs were off. And when I would walk along, I wasn't all one person. I didn't feel all connected. Part of my thoughts and memories were off somewhere, and stuff would happen to me. It was so awful that I had to forget it all. I was forcing myself to forget it. Part of me was like a royal princess, but it was stuck inside. I was a lady with manners, and people would find me kind and nice. Where I treat people well, but it was deep inside of me, and I was stuck. It felt good to feel disconnected, but it affected my breathing. So it's very interesting here that she's making the connection herself between her emotional state and the things she felt in her emotions and mind and her physical symptoms, which was the asthma and the breathing. If things were all over the place, it was hard to breathe deeply. I was always afraid my mother would hit me. I would be watching out of the corner of my eyes. I will not take a breath. If I took breaths, I might forget to be watchful. It was like I was partly dead. Only in dance class could I breathe deeply. I felt safe in dance class. I breathed deeply in art class and I felt safe there. In other classes, I just didn't feel safe. Part of me was half buried. Now remember, she said before she would go deep under the layers, and now she brings up this issue of being buried. Part of me was half buried, so I didn't need that much oxygen. The good part of me was deep down underneath. Parts of me were floating around, and the rest was buried in sand. I feel like, kind of like I'm telling you about a person that I don't even know. So here's an interesting statement. So she's even disconnected with her own self. It's not just that parts are disconnected, but she is disconnected with her own identity. I am disconnected. We have a fundamentalist family. We were not allowed to have feelings or thoughts. Everything was black or white. The real me was below the surface. I like sleeping. I used to have 8 blankets on my bed. The house was really cold. I was disconnected like a mobile. I had a head on one string and my hands on another string. and then my art side would take over. I have a head, and then there's a flat background underneath. Safely buried underneath is my body and my arms. But it was hard to put them all together. And if they were put together, I wasn't safe. But if I buried in pieces, I was safer. They wouldn't find all of the pieces at once. It would be hard to find the pieces because the ground is like slate. It would be okay, but if it was somebody I couldn't trust. But it was terrible if it was my father or my brother who found me. I would want to die. I didn't want to be alive. I wouldn't want to be under control of somebody like that. So again, this issue of being puppet on a string, being in control of by somebody else. So she was really at the mercy of the people who teased her, who tormented her. She felt like they were pulling her strings or controlling her. And what was her strategy? Was to become disconnected and bury different parts in different places so no person who was going to torment her or control her would find all the pieces at once. I was possessed, but not by a spirit, but by another human being. I was a pet that is in a cage that's too small for it and it can't move. I was trapped, tricked, manipulated, squashed, and abused. I was afraid he would get me to only think the way that he wanted me to think. Father let us be free for a long period and then be strict. It was so confusing. I didn't want him coming and taking me over. If Father notices me, his whole brain would come into mine. But I wanted to be normal. If he came into me, I wouldn't have a personality. If I didn't have a personality, then I would just only please him all the time. I wouldn't be in touch with my own ideas and thoughts. As a child, I felt more like I knew who I was, but as a teen, I didn't feel like that. I felt disconnected as a teen, but okay as a child. I think I became connected again when I was about 24. The child part came back and got unburied, and I could put myself back together. Now, it's really probably interesting for you as I'm reading this case to think, well, do patients really talk like that? How did you get a patient to say all these amazing things, all these things that sound so different from reality? Well, I didn't really do much except let her talk. And I just prompted her a little bit to follow lines of her own expression. So if you don't stand in the way, people will tell you what's on their heart and what's in their mind. So now we have the case, we have everything that she said to us, and now we want to see, how do we analyze all this? How do we put it together for ourselves and come up with a remedy? So in the analysis, the most unusual, it was a most unusual and insidiously abusive childhood. I think that's patently clear. There was mental pathology abounding, the father, the mother, the brother, and certainly friends and relatives as well. But of all the terrible things she relates, we want to find out what frightens her the absolute most. So not to project our own fears or concerns about the situation, but ask her, what is it that she feared the most, and how did she cope with the situation to remain her self-identity and her sanity? Well, the first clue to the answers to these questions comes from the dream. Sleeping at her parents' house, the walls are made of glass. She has no privacy. So privacy opens up the whole realms of her feelings of having no boundaries. She's easily taken over, controlled by someone else. If her father notices her, then his whole brain would come into hers. So that's the epitome of having no boundaries, is that if someone's next to you, your brain doesn't exist anymore, and their brain can come completely and take over yours. So she's most afraid of losing herself and her personality because she has no boundaries. And she describes that others are drifting into her. So having no boundaries is the most frightening thing for her, that has the most devastating consequences. So she says she's not allowed to have her own thoughts. Now that's how she experienced that. She was possessed not by a spirit, but by another person. So here are some of her statements. You'll recall, if he came into me, I wouldn't have a personality. If I would not be in touch with my own ideas and thoughts, I just didn't even feel that person was me. I went way below the surface and someone else was being me. So this is a clear theme of confusion of identity. And we have some rubrics that highlight this. We have in the mind section, confusion, identity as to his identity. Confusion, identity as to his identity, duality, sense of. Confusion of identity, errors of personal identity. And sensation of duality. Now, it's important if you're going to take these rubrics that it's absolutely clear and repeated from several different angles that is the case. And she brought it up and mentioned it in several different kinds of things. So I think we're very safe to say that this is a good rubric to start with in her case. She said she even changed her name 3 times, a great reflection on how confused she was, who she really was. We have a rubric for that called Delusions that he is 3 persons. So how did she cope with her fear of losing her personality? Well, she became disconnected. Her body is in different parts, buried under the ground. So that's so symbolic. I mean, her body obviously wasn't in parts, but the symbolism for her is that she felt disconnected and could bury herself in different places. If she was in pieces, someone could not find all of her. And that way she's protected from totally being taken over. Suppose you could imagine it's like somebody who has a big pot of gold coins, and they're going to bury a 10% of those coins in 10 different locations so that no one can find all of them in one place. The real her is under the ground and can't come out. As she said, it just didn't even feel like that person was me. I went way below the surface and someone else is being me. I came out of the bottom. I felt the real me was safe under those layers, and that was the only way I could deal with it. So we didn't have to speculate. We didn't have to analyze or try to interpret or misinterpret her words. She says it straight out. And that's really important, that you just take the patient's words as they come and don't put our own interpretation or additions to what they're saying. Then you're going to be more accurate in your prescribing. It's just not safe. I was disconnected like a mobile. I had a head on one string and hands on another string. I felt that one of my arms was hovering over in a corner and my head was where it was. My limbs were off. And when I walked along, I wasn't all one person. I didn't feel connected. I remember disconnected feelings. I wasn't real. I wasn't whole. It was like a puppet on a string. I wasn't in control of anything I wanted to do. So now we have 2 important themes that we can use, and they will direct us happily to one specific remedy. Confusion of identity and feeling disconnected or scattered about, that pieces of her are scattered about. And when we look at those 2 rubrics, which encompass everything that she had to say, in fact, if you go back to the original case, any statement in that case will link you to one of these 2 concepts. And if we look at that, we have a remedy, and that here we have some of the rubrics. I'm not going to read them all, but you can see how many rubrics there are about separated from the body, pieces scattered about, scattered on the bed, limbs are talking to each other, divided in 2, legs do not belong to her, cutting off. Dozens of rubrics here talk about that scattered feeling and really absolutely completely describe her. So if we have confusion of identity is one aspect, and feelings of disconnected into pieces that are scattered about is another aspect, and with each one is supported by many, many rubrics, we have a distinctive quality of one particular remedy. And that remedy is Baptisia, the wild indigo. It's a member of the legume family, which is now called Fabaceae. So for the Materia Medica, we look at several books. We can go to the concordant reference, and we can go to the synoptic reference. And for the Materia Medica, I'm going to turn this section over to Franz. So here's some of the Materia Medicas that we use. We use the plant book, the synoptic reference one, the concordant reference, and the Prisma reference. And they all have Materia Medica that's about Baptisia. Now, before I turn over to Franz, just quickly, I wanted to mention one other thing. So how do we have these Materia Medicas, and oftentimes we see in the Materia Medicas there'll be statements from provings or other cases and that don't exactly match what our patient says. So one of the skills in homeopathy is for you to be able to listen carefully to what your patient says and be able to identify that from the Materia Medicas, even if the wording is a little bit different. So for example, in Alan under Baptisia, he says, cannot confine his mind, sort of wild, wandering feeling. So here are some of the statements that, her statements, she talks about how disconnected her statements are. I'm sorry. When she was relating her case, there were many disconnected statements. They were rambling and disjointed. Now, if you read through the case as I presented, you'll see sometimes she jumps from topic to topic. And I purposely left that because that shows that she has this wandering statements showing how confused she is. She goes from one thing to another, wandering over different unconnected ideas. So she doesn't say, gee, my mind wanders about, but in the presentation of her case, that's exactly what happens. So you can use this rubric because you've observed in her presentation that her statements wandered. She also says her body is scattered around, but you can see that it's also about her thoughts being scattered as well. All for safekeeping, to guard them against from being taken over by another. So the wandering of her, the disconnected, scattered of her body is also wandering of her mind, and that links back to Alan's statement. Now Clark says, my body feels scattered about, tosses around to get pieces together, cannot sleep because he cannot get pieces together. Mind wanders as soon as the eyes are closed. Awakes with great difficulty of breathing. Lungs feel tight and compressed and must have fresh air. So again, reading this by itself, if you were studying Baptisia in Clark, for example, you might not be able to make the connection between what she said, but reading it now in light of what she said, I think you can see how to use what Alan, Clark, and our other Materia Medicas say to translate that into the language of the patient and vice versa. So this brings up the issue of sleep. So she says delusions, not slept enough. She talked about sleep and the feeling of sleep. She wore pajamas to school and the significant dream about sleeping at her parents' house. She buried herself under the ground for protection, which is a type of sleep. She didn't need much oxygen when she was buried, and you don't use as much oxygen when you're sleeping. So again, this connects up the physical pathology of asthma and the feelings and her delusion. So her asthma is also interesting in another regard. Baptisia has the following symptoms: fear of suffocation when he sleeps, arrested breathing when sleeping, asthmatic, asphyxia, desire to breathe deeply. Remember, she talked about deep breathing, and difficult breathing during sleep. So this again, you could use these rubrics initially, but even in retrospect, you can see that Baptisia fits the physical as well as the emotional state. So in reviewing the case, the rubrics, we can now see how everything is related. The confusion of identity is the result of the feelings of having no boundaries. That results in a feeling of not being safe from others coming in and taking over her personality. And that goes back to the confusion of identity. To cope with this, it is necessary to be disconnected, in pieces in her thoughts and body, buried away safely underground in a sleep-like state. There, since there's so little oxygen there, she can't breathe and might be suffocated, but it is worth it to be safe from losing herself. And so now we've connected up an otherwise disconnected case.
All of you will be familiar with the fact that our traditional Materia Medica comes from Herring's Guiding Symptoms and Allen's Encyclopedia. Burke drew on those two sources for his Materia Medica. Kent did the same, as did Clark. Now, in the beginning of the Guiding Symptoms, the remedies before the letter C, there is sometimes some useful information about the drug described in the Materia Medica. Later, after Herring's death, that becomes better when his son-in-law, Knur, and Moore and Rauer from New York, take over the setup of the Guiding Symptoms, and they inform us where all the symptoms come from. But to return to Baptisia tinctoria, it says in Herring's Guiding Symptoms that it is an old Indian drug, so used by the natives and medically used by the eclectics. The eclectics were the medical herbalist, one could say, until introduced in our school by a man called Thompson in 1857. The first useful proving was given by Douglas and others, followed by Hadley, Bird, Harpel, and Schenck. In 1871 by Wallace, etc. You can read it for yourself. But notice the bottom line. The most important symptoms come from practice, not from provings, from practice. And they have been given us by Dr. Bell. Here is what it says in Allen. And you see the same names returning. Douglas is misspelled in Herring, it is correctly spelled here. You also see how these provings were done. I have made that bold and I've underlined it. This tells you something in general about the use of substances for provings. It's very commonly done either in tinctures or very low potencies, in contrast to what is generally believed that provings are done by 30C. That is simply not so. So drops of tincture, drops of tincture, drops of tincture, and so on and so on. Here is Bell. I couldn't find the one that comes before this one because this is the second edition. That's after the death of Herring, so Herring couldn't have mentioned it. But it tells you where these observations of Baptisia were made by Dr. Bell in diarrhea related to dysentery, cholera, and so on and so on. So what does Dr. Bell say in this particular book related to the treatment of diarrhea with homeopathic remedies? This is what he says, among others. Now notice that there is hardly anything of the mental part that we by now recognize Baptisia from. It isn't in the provings. This is what has been observed by Dr. Bell in a single case of diarrhea. That's the second line put in bold. Thinks he is double or that his body is broken and tosses about the bed to get the pieces together. And below that, you find a few other things, and at the bottom, two other bold symptoms, bruised, sore feeling, and prostration. And then you notice the word attack of diarrhea. Herring's Guiding Symptoms takes part of it over, and you see here under the mind section, you see behind the Greek theta, that elongated circle with that line through the middle, under what clinical conditions these symptoms were observed. Typhus or typhoid. In one case of orchitis and some cases of gout. And you see there that the underlying symptoms are clinical symptoms. They are not proving symptoms. They have been observed on the basis of Bell's indication that there is something about being separated and scattered about. Then the total number of symptoms observed in typhus, typhoid cases in Baptisia treated with Baptisia apparently successfully is 103. Now keep that in mind, because later on that becomes important to realize why, particularly under these clinical conditions, under these ailments. So it tells us something about Haring's guiding symptoms. They were constructed from 1879 to 1889. Now Haring dies in July 1880. So everything behind that date, later than that date, is done by his son-in-law and two other German medical doctors that practiced homeopathy, Mohr and Rauwe. Haring's guiding symptom is mainly or only clinical symptoms. We keep on confusing that and believing that guiding symptoms is a collection of proving symptoms. Not so. Only the provings done by Haring himself that are in guiding symptoms, like lachesis, caladium, etc., they are proving symptoms. How do we know that for sure? Because in the introduction to the remedies, it tells where the acute symptoms can be found. It says that on the bismuthum, it says that on the colophyllum, it says that on the conium, it says that on the erigeron. So he doesn't bother to put the proving symptoms in his own guiding symptoms because they're already somewhere else. So why would he repeat that? His clinical symptoms and the guiding symptoms are drawn from about 60 sources and some 1,100 authors from various countries. 45 journals and periodicals I identified on the guiding symptoms in the introduction under the remedy. There it says who are the author of the symptoms and where these symptoms can be found. 45 journals and periodicals. 22 American, German, of course, because both Haring, Rauwe, Mohr, and Nur were all German. So their German was perfect. French a little, British, and Indian. 11 general or clinical Materia Medicas were used, and then particularly Rauwe's annual record of homeopathic literature is often mentioned. That was a record of synoptic overviews of cases, synoptic overview of clinical cases and their symptoms related or cured by the particular remedies. Same for Rückert. Rückert, de klinische ervaringen, as the name says, means clinical experience in their homeopathy, was published from 1854 and 1860 only in German, but as said, the German doctors were fully capable of understanding and translating those. But once again, it tells us guiding symptoms is a collection of clinical symptoms. Now, Vista Vintage, in comparison, because it can be compared to guiding symptoms to a certain extent, only it is more complete, has 770 remedies. Guiding symptoms has 430. Allen's Encyclopedia has 792. Only Medica has more, but Medica, many of these remedies are a single line, sometimes even a single word. We use for Vista Vintage 107 journals, many more than the guiding symptoms, for the simple reason that the guiding symptoms do not go any further than 1889, because then the whole project has been completed. And we were able to go up to 1926 by reading journals and periodicals and transactions. Transactions are the local meetings of the homeopaths discussing their cases and philosophy. 12 Materia Medicas, we have 1,703 authors, of which we have cases or provings or any other thing. And the period that we have covered in Vista Vintage is from 1822 to 1926. And once again, guiding symptoms only goes up to 1889. And Allen's goes up to 1879. That's 10 years earlier when it was finished. Altogether, I've been reading about 1 million pages or glanced over or go through to collect our data. Now, Vista Vintage has two groups of symptoms. Proving symptoms, or what we could consider provings, although we generally do not distinguish a proving from a self-experimentation. As the name says, self-experimentation is a solo undertaking. And there are many of those, actually many more, but they are generally just caught under the umbrella term of of provings, suggesting something of more substantial solidity than the reality really is. And then poisonings or effects, there are even much more of those. Poisonings are poisonings, and effects are, as sometimes in the old literature it is called, a fragmentary proving. Side effects, you could call it. Altogether, it's 1,265. Then the second part is clinical. There are case reports. You see how many there are. Clinical observations, Materia Medica summaries, and brief cases, of which there are a lot, called snippets. And everything in the original wordings. I have not changed anything about it, like repertories must do to make it more accessible in repertory language, like in Ellen, where all the symptoms are split up.
And I think this is an important point, because we look at the repertory to look up symptoms, but we could just inundate you with examples where the original proving said something and it was so misinterpreted, or the words were so jumbled or not taken properly, that the rubric doesn't reflect what the original symptom was at all, and in fact sometimes reflects exactly the opposite. So original wordings are really, really valuable and much more accurate.
Baptisia, to come back to Baptisia, this is what Vista Vintage has on Baptisia: 17 cases, 8 snippets, 2 clinical observations, 1 original proving, and 3 self-experimentations, mostly from the names that you saw earlier in Herring and Allen indicated as doing the provings. Although I have to say that Herring usually gives an impression of more, that there is more than there actually is. For instance, when he says under Baptisia, mentions all these various names of provers, you get the impression, wow, a lot has been done. But these provers are actually part of one proving. So you get the impression by mentioning 6 names, that's of course more than just said one proving was done. And that happens a lot in Herring. Our Baptisia cases, as all our other cases in Vista Vintage, have been given a title. And we hope that that title summarizes more or less the core, the essential of the case. The case is given in full, but the title, as you see them, printed in bold, is our words. That's not the title of the case as it is given in the journals. We have collected cases up to 1921. So once again, remind that guiding symptoms end in 1889. So beyond that, 32 more years have given us a couple of cases more. Now, it is done in the following way. So we give the title to the case, representing the core or essence of the case. Then comes the author of the case, then comes the title of the case, and then comes the place of the case. Monthly Homeopathic Review, Volume 10, Number 10, October 1866. That was the very first we could find of a reasonable case. And so it goes on. So the second comes from the Gersdorf, and you see the title there, Disease of Liver, comes in the New England Medical Gazette, Volume 5, and so on and so on. Number 3, case of muttering delirium and typhoid fever. There you see the name of Douglas. That was also under Herring and Allen, to be found in a journal called The Medical Counselor. To make a remark about this, there were many homeopathic magazines and journals in the days of Herring. Many more than Herring had. The reason is, of course, the time limit under which the guiding symptoms were constructed, but also the fact that Herring favored certain practitioners and disfavored others. We have not made that kind of choice. The choice is not up to us to say, well, he was not behaving according to classical homeopathy or whatever. It is the case that speaks for itself, and the principles behind this of the practitioners are of less concern. So Haring had particular ideas, and he was centered in Philadelphia. So many of his colleagues are from Philadelphia, and these tend to be more often quoted in Guiding Symptoms than from other places. So, case of two persons, case of parts not coming together, case of arguing both sides of an argument, all from Jones. And these come from the transactions, the meeting of the medical doctors in homeopathy discussing their cases and philosophy. Case of three uncovered persons, so there are four from this Dr. Jones. Case of broken body from Sherbino. Now, Sherbino you will not find commonly under Guiding Symptoms because he was from Texas. Not that there is something wrong with Texas, but it is outside of the range of Philadelphia. Then there's a French one, translated from Cartier. Then there is Robbins, and you see that the date now is already past the Guiding Symptoms, 1894. So they cannot be anywhere, nor in the Guiding Symptoms, nor in Allen's encyclopedia, because the date is later than any of those encyclopedias have. Bailey's. Now, I've underlined under number 13, Selden Talcott. That comes in the beginning of the 20th century. He was the head of a a psychiatric homeopathic hospital. And the man has fantastic cases and descriptions and overviews of remedies used in psychiatric cases, but he is seldom seen in the homeopathic literature. Now we have in Vista Vintage almost anything of him. So it is with George Royal, number 15. Erastus Case, you usually can find the computer programs, but Royal, usually you can't. Then we are almost at the bottom. You see, the last case we could find in the homeopathic recorder of 1921 is case of man with separated bones. And above that, you see the man whose arms and legs were pulled apart. This is to say that the basic symptoms of being scattered or being separated from your body or parts being separated from each other can be expressed in a variety of ways while still expressing the core idea of Baptisia. And that's what these cases are about. These cases use the idea, but not in the literal sense. It's the spirit of the idea, if I may express it like that. Then, under the effects, that means poisonings, you see that Baptisia was used as a hair wash. Remember, it was called tinctoria. And that may have effects because it is absorbed through the skin of the head. And that causes certain symptoms, and those we have summarized in the bold. So it is under number 2. So you see that's called a fragmentary proving, that essentially just means a poisoning. And so there is the proving of Douglas, that's indicated under the P in Vista Vintage. And once again, we notice it is done with the tincture. Now, why is that important? It is important because tinctures will link up with the toxicological aspects of any substance, if they are, of course, toxic. And Baptisia is sincerely toxic. Under ToxNet, it says, and I just summarized under source and substance, under cytosine, which is the main alkaloid of Baptisia, you find a full display of what that all can cause and which plants contain that substance, on the ToxNet it says the toxic effects are manifested in nausea, vomiting, pupil dilation, tachycardia, so racing heart, general weakness, colonic convulsions, and paralysis of respiration. See, that's the toxicological effect. Now, isn't that interesting that in that case of Linda, we saw the problems with breathing? That is linked up to the toxicological, physiological effects of the substance. Therefore, it is important to know that most provings have been done by the tincture so that you can use toxicological sources to complete your information. Self-information was done by Hadley. Then there is some other self-experimentation done by Wesselhoeft, and a third self-experimentations, which in Vista Vintage is indicated with SE, by Wallace.
So before I just conclude, I want to reiterate that Vista Vintage is a database you can add to your computer program, and in it are the 700 and some remedies, and the information has been culled out of 107 homeopathic journals that were published over a 100-year period. Now, we know that we have lost the perspective of what that actually means. Some of these journals were published 12 issues a year for 60 years. I mean, that's a lifetime's worth. Some of these journals went on for 30 or 40 years. Some of the journals were, so you had consistency and writing and support throughout many, many, many years. So this wealth of information has pretty much been lost to the homeopathic database and lost to our understanding. There were these so many authors that we are familiar with, you could probably say is a baker's dozen, but there were hundreds of really talented homeopaths who did amazing work, and it was written up and pretty much lost until Franz unearthed it and has compiled it and organized it in Vista Vintage. So Vista Vintage, it taps the wealth and knowledge and experience of a century of homeopathy and scores of skilled doctors. And all you have to do is you click on Baptisia and you're going to see 17 cases of a variety of information. And that will allow you, by reading the cornucopia of this information, to see the variety that is in Baptisia, but also the consistency, the threads of themes that go through all the various cases. So we wanted to thank you very much for attending, and we wanted to leave some time to answer your questions about any of the information that we presented.
Great. If you guys have any questions, you can type it in on the chat box or the Q&A, and I'll make sure to ask it. I don't know if there's any questions.
No, I guess everyone understood what we had to say. That's really wonderful. And we hope that between the source and substance and the Vista Vintage, that there'll be that these will be really, really useful tools to expand your knowledge of the remedies, and also mainly assist in prescribing.
Yeah.
Now, maybe, meanwhile, when nothing is coming up, I can spend a few more words on what I said about the toxicological aspects of remedies.
Great. There is one question. Linda and Franz, you're both getting thank yous for this amazing addition to our homeopathic knowledge. People are saying that. And then a question is, can you compare the source materials of source and substance with those sources and reference works?
Well, the sources, I'm not quite sure I understand the
sources
question.
and reference works.
reference works has a variety of sources. So when you have reference works, if you look at the list of books, there are a variety of books. Some of them are conventional Materia Medica, and we're talking about reference works in Mac Repertory. So if you look at the books, you have Allen's, you have American Homeopathic Review for some years, you have Burnett, you have Clark, you have some of our conventional Materia Medicas. But there's Hahnemann Monthly, there's about a dozen years of the Hahnemann Monthly, and then there's Homeopathic Recorder for a dozen years. So there are some of the vintage Materia Medica, and journals, but there's certainly not 107 different journals there, and the proceedings or the issues from many years worth. So I would say that in reference works, there might be 2%.
Yeah, but wait a second. The question was about source and substance, not about Vista Vintage.
I'm sorry.
Got that correctly.
I made a mistake. So you're quite right. It was about source and substance.
Well, reference works has a number of remedies, and I've taken all these remedies and put them in source and substance. But the idea of source is not so much the source of the homeopathic information, but the substance itself as the source of information. That's where the name source and substance comes from. It's the source of the substance that leads to additional information about the substance, and has also an additional info section about what of that information is available homeopathically. So it is an addition to reference works or radar opus of material that is nowhere else, because it does not come only from homeopathic resources, if that answers the question.
Yeah. And then Doug is saying he did actually mean comparing references in Vista Vintage with reference works.
So in that case, I would say that the focus of Vista Vintage is looking at our vintage journals. So these are 107 different journals. Only a handful are already available in reference works, and I would, generously speaking, maybe to say 3 to 5%.
Yeah, the same is true for radar opus. They have a number of transactions, etc., which is fine. They have that. Then they have homeopathic recorder a number of times, and a few other of these journals. But there are so many more that they don't have, because as Linda said, some of them, like homeopathic review and Hahnemannian Advocate, they appeared for decades. And is there any space in radar opus or reference works to have all these journals, all of them, line after line? No, probably not. But that's what we did in Vista Vintage. I read them all. So I made an extraction of useful material from these journals. And there's simply not the space nor the ability to digitalize all of that for radar opus or reference works programs, because that requires a lot of work.
But in addition, these journals are there, and Franz took the trouble of extracting the information and then organizing it. So, let's say if you have 12 journals a year over 60 years, and you're reading each journal as it came to your mailbox over those years, there would be different kind of articles or different remedies in different journals. So across 107 different journals, where he collected the 17 Baptisia cases out of all of that pages, so that it's more convenient for the modern user to say, okay, I can just touch Baptisia on reference works or radar opus, and out comes Vista Vintage, the 17 cases all organized for you. So that's the advantage to it. So in answer to your question, the existing journals that are in the references we have now are only a couple of percentage points of the journals and references that Franz reviewed to bring this product to life.
And I did that by going to certain websites who have all these journals available from libraries. There was a big library in San Francisco. It's still there, homeopathic literature. There's a big one in Boston. There is one in Cincinnati, I believe, and a couple of other places where you can access these journals and reading them, but then you have to extract the information. You cannot just simply pull everything out and put it in a repertory program. It won't work that way. So you have to extract it, you have to paste, you have to copy, and then you have to read everything through, whether it all came through in the right, how to say that? Well, there are many printing errors in these old days, just because when you copy it from a digital version that has been digitalized from 1860, there are usually all kind of typos in there. So you have to read everything through to make that decent English. And that's what I've done.
Mm-hmm. And then will you ever be able to offer both of these as ebooks?
No, well, they are in a sense ebooks because they are electronic databases connected to the programs. Mm-hmm. Without a search function, it would be very difficult to use them. And, we also ebooks are very difficult to protect electronically. So by having it associated with the program, you have all the advantages of the program as far as search functions and other books available along with it. So we felt that really is the best way to utilize this data is in conjunction with the existing platform of the programs.
Mm-hmm.
Radar Opus has a number of samples available from both Vista Vintage and Source and Substance, which are free for everyone. It's a sample of 33 remedies under both, which you can access for free. And that should be part of the program, or it should be sent around so you can get an idea how it is built up.
Yeah, so that's a good point, is that if you have an existing computer program, both Vista Vintage and Source and Substance, the Radar Opus offers you these free products, and that way you can look for yourself and peruse not just one remedy, but several dozen, and that helps you see the advantage to yourself that might make you enticed to want to get the full set.
Mm-hmm. And how much time have you spent reading all these journals that Vista Vintage represents?
We talk here about day in, day out for years.
Wow, that's amazing.
I have nothing else to do, so that's what I do.
And then a question for you, Linda. Somebody's asking how the outcome of giving Baptisia to the lady was.
Well, I didn't put the follow-ups there just due to lack of time, but she did remarkably well. The asthma cleared up, certainly, but even the denial of her feeling, I don't feel depressed and I don't feel anxious, that all went away because, in fact, there was this deep-seated feeling. All those dreams went away, and she just had a much more open and calm life. So she did remarkably well. I treated her for another 10 or 12 years, and she had an immediate good response that lasted throughout all those years.
That's amazing.
Followed her up for
and I followed her up for about 12 years.
Wow.
So thank you, everyone, for attending, and all of those people who are listening and might be listening in the future to the recordings.
Yeah, thank you so much. And then one last question for both of you. What's next after you've completed this amazing, enormous encyclopedia work? What are you working on next?
Well, that's kind of a big secret. We can't tell you yet.
One of them we can.
No, we can't tell yet.
No. We'll have a webinar on it.
But as soon as we can tell, we'll do another webinar to introduce that. But there's always amazing things coming from the fertile brain of Franz Vermeulen. He introduced Prisma 20-some years ago that really helped launch the idea and support the idea of source-based prescribing, which we all enjoy today. So, yes, there's more to come.
Great. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you, everybody, for joining.
You're welcome.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and you're getting a lot of thank yous.
Oh, well, thank you for everyone. Bye-bye
And
now.
France definitely has a fertile brain. Everybody's saying.
Thank you so
Okay,
much.
thank you so much. Bye, everybody.
Bye.